दोस्तों आज बर्मिंघम में रशीद हसन ख़ान की याद में एक लेक्चर मुनक्किद किया जा रहा है जो कि हर साल हुआ करेगा और उसका ये पहला लेक्चर है और आज का टॉपिक फ़लस्तीन है। इस मौके पर फ़लस्तीन से ताल्लुक़ रखने वाले जूस और फ़लस्तीनियन दोनों रहनुमा आए हुए हैं और स्कॉलर्स आए हुए हैं और वो बात करेंगे, अपने अपने मौक़िफ़ का इहादा करेंगे। मुझे उम्मीद है कि आपको बहुत पसंद आएगा ये लेक्चर। तो ये मैं अब जो है अभी हॉल में जाऊंगा, अभी मैं उस लेक्चर की आपको बताता हूँ कि क्या हो रहा है। अभी देखिए ये लेक्चर की जो पोस्टर है मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ और उसके बाद मैं अभी अंदर हॉल में जाता हूँ ताकि आपके हॉल में जाने के बाद आपको वो लेक्चर की जो कार्रवाई है वो सुन सकें। तो थोड़ी सी बदनज़ी होगी, मेरे ख्याल में एक पॉज हो सकता है कि नहीं हो सकता, मैं देखता हूँ। मैं कोशिश करूँगा कि वहाँ पे आपको लेक्चर सुनने का। ये हमारा स्टॉल है जो यहाँ पे, और ये यहाँ कुछ लोगों ने जो है वो हमारे दोस्त हैं फ़लस्तीनी और जूस, उन्होंने जो है वो अपने स्टॉल्स लगाए हैं और ये आज इस बात को समझने का मौका मिलेगा कि फ़लस्तीन का इशू क्या है और वहाँ के रहने वाले उस इशू को कैसे समझते हैं। ये कुछ किताबों के स्टॉल हैं और ये हमारे कॉमरेड जो हैं वो हसन जावेद दरवाज़े पर हैं और टिकट जो है लोगों से वो वसूल कर रहे हैं। और ये साथ ही किताबें हैं कुछ रशीद हसन ख़ान की लिखी हुई और वो हमने यहाँ बिकने के लिए रखी हैं। तो अब मैं जो हूँ वो अंदर जाता हूँ। लेकिन पॉज कैसे होगा? Can you do this pause?
What's the bit today?
Pause, just to pause. No,
You want to get rid of that?
no, just a pause, like stop and then I go, or maybe.
Oh, yeah. She got behind you?
No, no. I was thinking that it's recording, stop, and then I go inside.
Right.
No, but it's okay. Leave it. Okay.
Physically separate entities called the Palestinian territories, which I showed in the map, Gaza and the West Bank, alongside Israel. The West Bank named because of the River Jordan. Gaza and West Bank, I posit, are not independent states, are not fully independent states. Most of the settlements are all in the West Bank. Both Israelis and Palestinians have claims to the land going back centuries. But the present day states are relatively new entities with new borders. Number two, why are the Israelis and Palestinians fighting? My 75-year-old neighbor asked me the other day, why is there fighting between Palestinians and Israelis? He's a religious chap. He said they are both descendants of the prophet Abraham. If you believe that, and you have a right to believe or not to believe even that, and so they must be cousins. The reason is about land, I believe. You know, the conflict is over who gets what land and how it is controlled. That's also very important. I can nominally be given a house, which may still be called my house, but the owner of the house is not myself, and I have the constant threat of being evicted from my house, being thrown in the backyard, and then when I want to approach the road, somebody checks my credentials to allow me passage into the other road to visit my brother. So be careful when they say Palestinian territories. The execution of this whole business is very complex. Understandably, because where are the borders? That's one question. Can the Palestinian refugees return to their former homes? After 1948, I think about 700,000 Palestinians were evicted. Some of them actually took the keys of their homes with them. And there are now 7 million descendants in a diaspora all over the world. So do they have the right to return? If I'm a Jew, then I have a right to go to Israel, even though I was born in London and I live in Aberdeen. I might as well live in the North Pole, but if I'm a Jew, I have a right to go and live in Israel. But as things stand, the Palestinian refugees do not have a right to return to their own villages of their ancestors. So that's a very complex issue. That's just a graph of the settlements. I think Marwan's going to talk more about it. But that's also the human cost so far. And this graph demonstrates the cost in human life and the peaks in that. The orange bars tell you the numbers of deaths on the Palestinian side, and the blue bars tell you the numbers of deaths. Any death is a tragedy. Any death of any, I'm a doctor. For me, a patient, is a person, is a human being. I never ask them. In fact, our board has said, sent out an email saying, you've got to ask if they have a right to treatment in the NHS. I ignore that. I just treat the patient because that's what I was trained to. It's not my job. You can come and ask them. But a human life that is lost is a tragedy, and we should count that as a tragedy. I'm not going to compare this number and that number, but any Israeli child who's killed is a tragedy. Any Palestinian child who's killed is a tragedy. But there is a disproportionate number for obvious reasons, because a slingshot cannot fight an F-16. It's a completely erroneous conclusion that a slingshot can threaten the existence and integrity of a highly technological weapon. The fourth question is the most important one. How on earth is this conflict going to end? And briefly, there are three main ways of ending this conflict. The one-state solution. Forget about these Palestinian territories. Make it all Israel and give everyone equal rights. The problem with that is, because remember, the creation of Israel, according to the Balfour Declaration, according to their origins, and we have to respect that, is that it's a Jewish state. And if there is a one-state solution, there'll be a demographic time bomb. And eventually, if the Arabs exceed the numbers of Jews, that will cause problems if there are free elections. And so I think the one-state solution is a difficult one. This middle one is an apocalyptic solution, which is the destruction of one side. Now that's not a joke. This has been a plausible solution on both sides. There are many Palestinians who I don't agree with, and who I think any common sense person wouldn't agree with, who deny the existence of the right of Israel to exist, and who talk about the destruction of Israel and complete annihilation. There are also Israelis, not so much in the news, who also call for the complete destruction, and that's the genocidal solution. We don't want that. We have, I hope, but it seems that we have forgotten, considering recent events, and we have to see the result of the European election, forgotten. We must not forget, we should never forget what happened in the 30s and in the 40s to millions of Jews, communists, people with mental illness, homosexuals. As I was walking from New Street Station today, I was very pleased to see multiple colored banners celebrating homosexuality and their right to exist. And I approached her stall and I said, I've come from Scotland and I'm with you. And she gave me this badge, which is a Scottish flag and a gay pride flag that I'm very proud of. So peaceful coexistence is possible. A Scotsman can spend a fiver in England. That's my aim. The third solution is the two-state solution that is talked about a lot. And there is probably the preferred solution that there should be two states, but they need to be viable states. You cannot have a Bantustan situation whereby you have to cross so many hurdles to go and visit your auntie. It needs to be contiguous, so there are problems there, but it remains to be seen, and we will discuss it later. The two-state solution is a possibility. So, in conclusion, Western powers, empires, have interfered in the Middle East for 1,000 years. I mean, you can actually, I went back to the First World War, You can go back to the 11th and 12th centuries. I recently went to Clermont-Ferrand, where a pope once announced that, look guys, and it was all economical, look guys, these people are impeding our pilgrims and killing our pilgrims on the way to the Holy Land. We've got to go and fight them. And we know what happened after that, the series of crusades and the massive bloodshed that followed. So you can go back even to that period. And if you believe in the Bible and the Quran, you can go back to biblical wars and extend it as far back as you wish. The end of the First World War of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire gave way to superpower neo-colonial hegemony in this area. We saw that from the Sykes-Picot. And we know that today. I mean, it is not rocket science to understand that Saudi and the United States and Britain are allies. It's a fact, a well-known fact. The occupation under international law is illegal of Arab lands, and the world has to consider that and do something about it. I think the other events, I said, it's very important to remember. I know this because in my own city, the Saudis funded an organization from which one of our local lads, who was originally their parents were from Bangladesh, went and joined ISIS. It was funded by them. So be very careful who you sup with, i.e. the Saudis. Maybe, yeah. Then
Can we have a question?
Sorry, yeah.
No,
That's going to be very rude. Can you let him finish talking?
Yeah, no problem.
No, can you just let him finish talking, please?
No, that's fine. That's fine. You will have your time because I think this is how we should do it. There's evidence of war crimes by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is not my conclusion. Many human rights organizations have concluded that in Yemen, perpetrated using weapons supplied by our country. So these guys, Sykes, Picot, McMahon, the Sharifs, Saddams, remind me of this amazing speech by Mark Antony, the famous one that starts, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ear, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And he says, "The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones." And I will finish there, and you can ask your question.
Hello, I'm a 2-year revert to Susan.
Sorry, I'll give you the mic.
My name's Isabel Smith. I'm a 2 years revert to Susan and a geopolitical
Take the mic.
activist. Hi, I'm a 2 years revert to Sufism and a geopolitical activist. I could have been a British agent, probably. I am an Orientalist, but I've decided to dedicate my brain to the other side. My fiance is actually in Libya. He was at Zilla on the oil field a week last Saturday and killed 8 ISIS. There were 24 of them, and he lost a comrade. We've been together for 4 years. There was a cross-party inquiry that successfully blamed David Cameron for the rise of ISIS in 2015. I got those documents. First of all, I'd like to say that the 2 British agents that were involved in Sykes-Picot were used. And
There were not 2 British, there was French and
French,
British.
yeah. Well, Lawrence was broken-hearted and none of his advice was taken. Secondly, the figures of the Libyan refugees in Tunisia is an oxymoron. ISIS was actually trained, and they were actually trained for the invasion of Libya. There are just over 5.5 million residents of Libya in total. 1.5 million are in Egypt. 1 million have fled to European
The
countries.
point, can you come to
And
your
there are still
point?
3.5
We know the
million there.
statistics.
Tunisia has always closed the borders. And thirdly, Saudi Arabia has never funded ISIS. They
Okay,
were
thank you very
Iran,
much.
Sham.
That's great.
It was Qatar, Tunisia and Turkey, NATO countries.
Possibly, yeah.
What was the question?
So,
Yeah.
you didn't ask the question, by the way, on my presentation, so I think I need to be more strict next time.
You'll be able to read my book in a couple of years' time. Dan
Okay, I look forward to that.
Sure,
So
we
I
will.
think we should now, in the interest of time, move on. And I will, I've been given the task to moderate the questions and answers. And please forgive me if I am like a schoolmaster when it comes to curtailing questions. But thank you very much for your contribution. Very much appreciated.
The rest of it's fine.
So the task now I have is to introduce our two speakers. That's the highlight of today's event. And I'm very pleased to have two excellent speakers. Sadly, our third speaker was ill and couldn't join us. So our first speaker is Dr. Marwan Darwish. He actually needs little introduction, but for those who don't know of him and his work, he's a principal lecturer in peace studies and a tutor for a degree in peace studies in Coventry University. Dr. Darwish described himself as deeply concerned about the growing violent response to social, political, and economic injustices in the world, and the lack of constructive, peaceful interventions. He believes that active non-violent civil resistance and conflict transformation is the key to transform structural and direct violent conflict. His research aims to develop practices and knowledge to enhance successful peaceful resistance in partnership with local and international movements and to inform policymakers. He has published extensively, most importantly, Popular Protest in Palestine, The Uncertain Future of Unarmed Resistance. So without much ado, I will give the floor to Marwan to kindly share his talk with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And first of all, it is inspirational really for me to learn about the legacy, the vision of Rasheed, which I didn't know previously. It is really touching to see that this person inspired so many people all over the world, you know, with his vision and his social justice. I didn't read much, but I could tell that this person could see a society based in inclusion, and the principle of the inclusion is equality and justice. And in a way, you raised for us a reflection to think about this. A couple of you raised the issue and the reflection of what society, what the inclusion in this society. I want to pose another question for us to think about, which is, what are the principles of inclusion in this society? We want a multicultural society. We want a society that could live together, but we must keep asking the question, what are the bases of this society? What is the foundation of this society, the political, the social, the economic foundation of this society? And with that, I wanted to say, to think about Palestine and Israel. What are the foundation of this society that I want to envisage? So, and I want to, in my talk, which is by 25 minutes, you stop me, because I want to stick to less than 30 minutes. But what I would like to do with you today is to share with you a mix of my history, and as all you will agree, the personal history is also politics. So I want to share with you my own history of the politics of Palestine with my, let's say, understanding of the politics as a lecturer in peace studies who studied and learned this topic. And thank you very much for your introduction. You did wonderfully in terms of introducing the background. I think there were a few of my PowerPoint slides I'm going to skip.
Apologies.
So it's fantastic. I think you set up very well the context for us, which is I was going to mention, but I will skip that because I think that setting makes it now really to move into what happened and what can be done. So very briefly, I'm a Palestinian. I was one of those who were lucky to remain in Palestine after 1948. My parents managed, although they're internally displaced, they were living in an area. I come from a village which is called Umm al-Fahim, which is south of Nazareth, within Israel. I hold an Israeli passport. I'm a Palestinian, proud to be a Palestinian. I was all my years, like you in the university, even younger, I was involved in political, social change in Palestine. And I wanted to see a different society. I was active for many years in Israel with Jewish, anti-Zionist, liberal even sometimes. I was willing to cooperate with them to try and create a vision that is based on equality, on justice. So I born to a family, a Muslim family. We become the refugees from a village which is 3, 4, 5 miles from where my parents live now. Most of the land being confiscated. The first time I went there, it was probably 30 years after that. And it was I would say it's a trauma for my dad to take us back, to show us originally where we come from. It was really very painful. And it is on it today based a kibbutz, which is the irony that this should be a vision of socialism. However, the type of socialism that the kibbutz is presenting is not inclusive. You can't be an Arab Palestinian citizen in this cooperative or this kibbutz. I want to tell you a little anecdote. Many of my colleagues in the university, they are shy and sometimes feel shame to tell me. I was with a colleague in visiting, and we traveling in Israel, and he came and said to me, Marwan, I want to tell you something, but not be upset. I said, no, come on, Alan, what is it? He said, I came as a volunteer in a kibbutz in the 70s. And Alan he's a Buddhist, he's an open-minded person, he's a visionary. I said to him, what happened? Why? So he said to me, look, I thought this is the alternative vision. I came, took me 2 months, I realized that there is Arab villages next to the kibbutz in Tiberias. I took him actually back to see it. We drove. I said to him, don't worry, I will drive you. You cross the line when you're understanding, token for understanding. So, and I went with him, and he actually had another visit to the kibbutz, now with a different perspective. So that's the vision that a lot of people thought of Israel. So I born in Al-Fahim to a Muslim family. I went to a Christian school. I want to make absolutely clear, as a Palestinian, we are Muslim, Christians, and other smaller minorities in Palestine, and it is not, I am secular myself, so I want to make it absolutely clear that the question is not about religion. It's about land, it's about self-determination.
Yeah.
So, from that all will inspire me, which is something secular based on a vision of inclusiveness. So, what happened with my family? We lost our land, we become internally refugees, but that is one story. We are the lucky to stay inside Israel as a Palestinians, the majority. Is that, it goes up and down, yeah, show me which year. Okay, so you did that very well. I can't see it here, so I can't see it reflected here. I can see it reflected there. Huh?
It's not.
No, it's not, didn't change. So maybe you just put, if you put it in full, maybe, full slide.
No, try.
Show, say,
Now you try.
no. Oh yeah, here it is, down to the right. Okay,
Thanks, Joe.
that's not going again.
You call him again.
Is it, where, I need to point it somewhere? Okay. Yeah, have a look. I'm prepared without this PowerPoint. I learned working internationally that that with technology you all the time might have a
It's left and right.
it's left and right. So up, okay, let me just try. Okay, okay, yeah. So you talked about that. You talked about the setting of the Middle East. But I wanted to go to the most critical points in this conflict, which is pre and what happened in 1948. If you look at the figures, you can see what happened in terms of the population between 1914. We were only 85,000 Jews who lived in Palestine, and there are some of them, I would say, are Palestinian Jews who lived before, spoke Arabic, part of the culture, and integrated there. And if you look, we see the increase in number until 1947. And immediately after that, the shift in terms of number changes. The Palestinians within Israel, the Palestinians in their land, become a minority from 700,000, as you mentioned, to only 10%, about around 100,000. So this is obviously, we become the victims of what's happened in Europe. And there is a moral question here to many people need to think about it. We as a Palestinians, we had nothing to do in terms of the genocide that happened in Europe and the war in the Second World War. However, we become a victim of this history. So, so this is what happened in 1948. Situation where the Palestinian, most of the land become under Israeli control, then the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This is almost 22% of the historic size of Palestine, what is we have today in the West Bank and Gaza. But I wanted to tell you what was the impact of 1948 to many of the Palestinians. As I said, we lost our source of income. There was a fear. We lost in the war. A military rule imposed. When you talk, you reminded me of that. From 1948 to 1966, in Israel, a military rule imposed on the Palestinian citizens who stayed inside Israel. And I want to give you a little, what was the military rule that imposed on this minority? If you wanted to go to a hospital, you needed a permit. If you want to go to work, you needed a permit. If you want to travel anywhere outside your village, you needed a permit from the military governor in your village or your city. So we become, my parents, from my mum's side, from my dad's side, who had owned land, become cheap labor. My dad had to go and look for work in Tel Aviv to sell his labor, working illegally sometimes, without permits, come sometimes every 2 or 3 weeks to visit us because there was no permit. Now, you can get a permit if you will collaborate, if you will be quiet, if you will, the system will able to co-opt you. So, but we are not just victims. I'm doing a research about this period, trying to understand how people actually resisted under the military rule. And I'm sure you who lived and understand what is a military rule will be able to imagine. I give you two examples. One of them, how people under military rule inside Israel were able to resist. And not just being a victim. Weddings used to be a way of expression of resistance, what we call in the literature of nonviolence the everyday resistance, the quiet resistance. In my town, in '49, they asked everybody, including the women, to come to the center of the village to celebrate the Independent Day of Israel. Do you know what women did? They went. Obviously, they couldn't say no. But what they did, they painted their face with a charcoal as an expression in Arabic culture of sadness. And my village is called Al-Fahm, the mother of charcoal. So women went there to celebrate, but they were singing in Arabic sad song, sorrow song, and with their faces black, as an expression of resistance. Quiet resistance, not military, not arms, not even confrontational. This is, I wanted to say, that is part of the survival of the Palestinian in a way, that they were willing to resist. But I want to go back and say what happened in 1948? What was the nature of that regime which Israel is based on? What is the inclusion, what are the principles? The nature of the regime, I want to say it in two words: colonial, settler, and based on racial discrimination. Now I want to give you a few examples. I'm not going to, because lots and lots of things written about it. But the logic of colonialism is that the control of the land, as you said, the control of the resources, but it's more than that. It's the destruction of the national cultural manifestation of the indigenous population. It's true here, it's true in the US, it happened in New Zealand, it's happened in Australia, and it happened many other places around the world. The destruction of the manifestation of the indigenous population and impose a new liberal ideas, a new identity. This is what we have to face as a Palestinian. We have to face it from 48 to 66. And the other side, the racial side, discrimination, is the preference of one population based on ethnicity against another one. And to do that is only colonialist settler ideology will justify that, based on race rather than citizenship. There are more than 42 laws and regulations in Israel. You could visit. I saw you use B'Tselem. There's Adana for human rights organization. Laws and regulations that is the analysis of it will show you that the discrimination is based on ethnic affiliation, because you are a Palestinian, because you are an Arab. I don't want to give the 40 examples, I'll give you 2 or 3. Recently, in July 2018, they passed a law in Israel called the Nation State Law. It is absolutely clear, no shame, that the basic law passed in Israel give privileges to and supremacy to the Jewish citizens in Israel. Where is the inclusiveness? Which principles of liberal democracies, I'm not even talking about socialist, liberal principles that will be acceptable? Why Jewish citizen and not me as a Palestinian, lived there, born there, can't be equal? Why such a law want to give privileges to one group? This law had a clear distinction of apartheid characteristics. Exclusiveness of one group, of Jewish group, in fact, based on religious and ethnicity. That's an example. There was, in the early days of the State of Israel, they have to pass the law of return, which is, you mentioned, but what is the justification that David is not here? He's a Jewish, but I was going to ask him this question. What is the justification that will give David, who is not here, the right to go to Israel, claim a citizenship, and live there, and not to give the right to a Palestinian maybe who's sitting here, who's a refugee. What equality is this? What is the principle that is this law gives privilege to one group? What is the moral justification of it? What is the ethical basis of it? Another law to silence any criticism in Israel passed in 2011 called the Nakba Day. The Nakba is the day of the catastrophe when the Palestinians lost their land, their homes in 48. And this law came specifically to prevent Palestinian teachers, civil society organization, activists, people in Jewish activists to commemorate or to talk about Nakba. And if you do, you will be punished for that. So I want to argue that Israel between 48 and 66 managed to create a model of control by military rule that it's replicated later on with much more sophistication, with much more equipment on the West Bank and Gaza. And Ilan Pape and Neve Gordon, two Israeli critical scholars, they said that Israel managed to develop the modality of control in these decades, between 48 and 66, and to make it more sophisticated later on when they occupied the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. How am I doing with time?
You're okay, you've got
I'm okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. So, the refugees, when we mention refugees, well, there are people who are living today for second and third time being refugees. In Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. You mentioned the 1967 war. It is Yom Kippur and it's Ramadan war, and we are in Ramadan, and that was the war when it happened in October 1973. And Israel here, it's what they did. It's not just they occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the Golan Heights, Sinai. And look what we are recently listening, tweeting by Netanyahu and Trump. They want to establish a new settlement city in the Golan Heights under the name of Donald Trump. That is the society, that is the vision that we coming from Israel today. The Sinai is being returned after the Camp David agreement between Israel and Egypt. Still, it is, even if it's returned to Egypt, Egypt does not have full sovereignty over it in terms of military control. So the Golan Heights, Sinai has been returned. The West Bank and Gaza is still known both. UN Resolution 242, 388, 338 clearly recognize that these areas are occupied according to international law, and Israel does not give a damn about international law or UN resolution. And so that's partly where I see the frustration among a lot of people in the West and in Asia, and that they cannot understand why this double standard. However, I don't want just to play that we are victims. No, there was an agency. We were able to organize ourselves. The establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was a significant change in the Palestinian history. We realized not Saudi Arabia, not Egypt, not Jordan, not Syria, it's the Palestinians who will hold the responsibility for any future change. And that was the establishment of the PLO. And I want to say I'm very proud that the PLO is an organization that reflects different political, ideological perspective, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, nationalist, religious, bourgeois nationalist, all of them come under that umbrella of the PLO. Now the PLO, in very brief, the struggle of the Palestinians started with the PLO using an armed struggle, which is legitimate, not what I want, but that's international law. That was legitimate for people under occupation to reject, to struggle against occupying force, but with all the means that they have. They realized, the PLO, that it is not possible to defeat or to make change only through military means. They've been destroyed in Lebanon after the invasion of Israel in South Lebanon, expelled to Tunisia, and what happened parallelly that the Palestinians who remain in the West Bank and Gaza become a much more important player and actor in the Palestinian politics. So civil society organizations, social change movements, organizing communities, which started to make the balance between the leadership inside and outside, moving towards the inside. And immediately after that was the outbreak of the first Intifada, which is the most well-organized, non-violent, resistant movement organized by civil mobilization by the Palestinians. This has actually made a little change into the power relation between Israel and Palestinians. It's exposed Israel military violence that they used during 1987, 89, 90. How civilians, I don't want to remind you that Israel, in terms of military, we know 4th, 5th place in the world in terms of military power. So if you look at the asymmetry of power between the Palestinians and Israel, the gap is huge. So one of the realizations is that it is important to find ways of undermining this power that Israel has had. So, one of the people I interviewed in the book, he said to me, Marwan, are you a boxer? I said, no. And he said, would you go and play boxing against Muhammad Ali? I said, no, because I will lose. And he said, that's what we need to think about. Israel is a strong military power. We should think of what is the thing that will undermine this power. How can we include more civil resistance to undermine this power? So, 2 minutes. I want to leave with that. I'll move to the vision of what I want to see. Well, just before that, one note to say, I talked a lot about the Palestinians, but there's Israeli society. You know, part of this conflict, it is understanding for what's happening in Israel, the Jewish Israeli society. And I have a little, just will summarize me reading it. Thank you. You did that very well. How we want a genocide, expulsion, subjugation, absorption, or sharing. This is what I wanted to reflect. And this is really the question that I think is in front of us.
Jesus is the activist.
Is it? But I wanted to say something about, I don't know if I had the slide there, about the Israeli society. The Israeli society is not a one homogeneous sort of society. There is internally there is discrimination inside Israel between Ashkenazi and Oriental Jews. Israel, when it's formed by and for serving the European Ashkenazi Jews. The discrimination that Oriental Jews faced in the 50s, the early 50s, when they came from Libya, from Tunisia, from Egypt, humiliating. It was so humiliating that they wish they will go back, take us back to Yemen. I went to Yemen, I visited the Jewish community in Yemen. And I know people in Yemen who still, until now, they're fighting to find out what happened to some of the Yemeni children who came in the 50s and they disappeared. The civil social resistance in Israel was at its height in Israel against injustice in the 70s. The Black Panthers in Israel in the 70s went and broke into supermarkets, wanted to distribute food for Oriental Jews who were under poverty in Israel. We have the most right-wing government we witnessed in Israel in the last decades. Who is the friends of Israel today? Trump, Brazil, populist politicians. Victor Orban. Who is the friends of this of the Israeli state at the moment? Saudi Arabia, Oman. Is that the model of cooperation between Israel and the rest of the world? So, what is the future? If you allow me, the future for me is simple. Call it whatever you want to call it. Palestine, Israel, Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel. Call it whatever we call it. There are three principles in this vision that I have. No discrimination based on ethnicity or religion. Social justice in this community. Right of the Palestinian to return. And to return, I'm not saying they have to return to their own home or this. That's the principle, the moral responsibility, the ethic responsibility that give any Jew to want to go back. They should be open to all the Palestinians. And then the state, this state, should be based on equality, on citizenship. If I want to dream further, I would say it should be based in some sort of socialist principles, not on religious. I was secular all my life. I'm critical of Hamas to the core in their politics. But I also want to say that we were very proud in the first election happened in the occupied Palestinian territories and later on in 2006 when we managed to have the most transparent and clean election that we had in the Middle East in 2006. I wasn't happy about the outcome because Hamas won. But the rest of the world punished us because we wanted to practice basic democratic rights and vote for, and Palestinians decided to vote for Hamas. So the rest of the world boycotted the Palestinians and imposed sanctions. The sanction that you're talking about with OCHA, so you use the UN. It is incredible. The list, if you look at it, you can look at Google OCHA and list that being prevented from goods to go to Israel. What the spaghetti will do to harm people, to import it to Gaza. Why the children there have to drink so polluted water, so equipment to purify water and clean water is prevented.
Shame.
So what I'm saying is, with all my criticism, because I'm secular, I come from a different lenses, I'm not a religious person, but I respect a political process that happened. We punished for that. I want to find a way that all these groups, all these perspectives, in Israel too, will be included. I worked for more than, well, at least 15 years, bringing Palestinian and Israelis together, teachers, lecturers, this. But one thing that was motivating me all this work is the equality that should be between all the people who live in this area. And thank you very much.
A number of questions for which we will have time later. Barbara, are we having any breaks?
No, I think it is not.
Our next speaker is Mr. Muhammad Amin. Mr. Amin has on several occasions been listed as one of the 100 most influential Muslims in the UK. He has an extensive curriculum vitae, but briefly, he graduated with a mathematics degree in Clare College, Cambridge, and his career progressed. In 1999, he became a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, receiving a medal for the best fellowship thesis submitted in that year. Mr. Amin is chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum, co-chair of the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester, chairman of the Council of the Islam and Liberty Network, chairman of the Advisory Board of Children of Peace, and chairman of Curriculum for Cohesion. So without much ado, Mr. Amin, please share your thoughts with us.
Can we turn this sideways so I can see it on? Oops, I pulled the cable out. Let's go on. I'm holding it, used to it. The monitor cable came out while we were moving the thing around. We plugged it back in, but at the moment it hasn't recognised it. Right.
Perfect. You okay, man? I'm just here for the moral support.
Good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. I want to stress that today I'm speaking entirely on my own behalf and not on behalf of any of the organisations that I'm connected with. And that's why I've chosen the title, One Muslim's Perspective on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
It's not advancing on there.
Yeah,
You need to go to slideshow mode.
Yes, that will happen. Did it get? Yeah, you put it slide, show, and then it might work. I
I've
gave it.
noticed that it doesn't change on the laptop sometimes.
I've just turned the volume up. So.
I'd like to see the slideshow on there as well.
See the slides change on the PPT.
Oh, okay.
If all possible, because
Yeah, I should be able to do that.
Otherwise, just keep.
I don't want to keep turning around.
Yes, yeah, that will happen then. Yeah, that should be alright.
If I just cancel it.
Yeah. Because normally with laptops, you do actually get the key slide that's being projected.
Well, I know. We had it on presenting it to you.
No, what I want to see on there is the actual slide.
I think it should still. Yeah. Is it currently on?
Close it all and just compare everything.
That's fine. That's good. Sorry about that.
Give you 2 extra minutes.
Thank you. In many ways, this is the most important slide in the entire presentation. Something I feel very strongly about is that every one of us has the responsibility to decide for every issue in the world, and the world is full of issues, to what extent do we actually want to get engaged in this issue or not? And then, if we do, to decide for ourselves what we think about it, rather than being told by other people what to think. And then to ask the question, what can I do personally, rather than saying this is what other people should do? And finally, I've got some reading material for you, because I think too many people have very strong views about Israel-Palestine without acquiring an enormous amount of detailed information about it. And I've been following this dispute for definite since I was about 12 years old. I'm now nearly 69. So my views have been changing all through my life. You've already heard my sort of introduction. I'm not going to go over any of the details, but I do want to mention there the address of my personal website, where eventually this presentation, which I'm recording the audio of as we speak, will end up. And on it you will find other things I've written about the dispute, presentations I've given in the past, etc. So why do I care? Because it's obvious that I do, otherwise I wouldn't be spending the whole of my Saturday coming down here to Birmingham from Manchester to talk about it. Many people, particularly Jewish supporters of Israel in this country, complain about the amount of attention that the Israel and Palestine dispute gets. And they've got some grounds for that. By land area, Israel is only the 150th largest country in the world. Unimportant. By population, it's a bit more important, the 100th. By GDP, a bit more important still, 33rd. That isn't a reason for getting hung up about it. And other conflicts have killed far more people than this conflict. In the late 90s, there was a major conflict in the eastern Congo where the death toll ran into the sort of low millions, 3 million, 5 million. Far, far more people than all the people who died from 1947, 48 onwards till today in Israel and Palestine. But there's another way of looking at it. Jerusalem is the holiest place in the world for over 2 billion Christians. And the third holiest place in the world for about 1.5 billion Muslims. There aren't many Jews. Only about 14 million Jews in the entire world, but to them also Jerusalem is the holiest place there is. It's the whole of the land, as they see it. And the one thing which is very clear is that people care passionately about this dispute. Unfortunately, some of them care about it passionately the way they care about football teams. They pick a side, that's their side, and everything their side does is right, and everything the other side does is wrong. And the world is much more complicated than that. Who tends to take which side? It's pretty obvious that most Jews are pro-Israeli for very good reasons. A more interesting category, and particularly important in America, are people that are classified as Christian Zionists. If you look at the pro-Israel lobby in the USA, yes, the USA has about 6 million Jews, but it has something like 40 or 50 million Christians who are passionately pro-Israeli. Although some of those are Christians you wouldn't necessarily really want to have on your side, because they want all the Jews to go to Israel so that they can be killed in the second coming of Jesus Christ. The political left tends to be today pro-Israeli. Historically, it's the other way around. We had a Labour government in power in the late 1940s when Israel was established, and in those days it was well understood that the Conservative Party was much more pro-Arab than was the Labour Party. Now things have switched around. Again, it's understandable why most Muslims are pro-Israeli, but historically Israel's had support from Muslim-majority countries like Turkey and Iran under the Shah, and we've heard today how it's getting quiet support from the governments of places like Saudi Arabia. And in general, in Africa, Latin America, countries that have been colonized in the past tend to be more sympathetic to the Palestinians. So what do I think about it? And again, it's complicated, but my views have been changing steadily. I'm both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian. You can be both. And I don't really want to take sides, but I'm probably, to be honest, a bit more pro-Israeli than I am pro-Palestinian. My wife certainly thinks that. She gets very annoyed with me on many occasions. The most important thing of all to understand is the Jewish perspective on Israel. For Jews, it's quite simple. Israel is about survival. There's a long and terrible history of European persecution of Jews, Christian persecution of Jews. And that continued until the European Enlightenment, when we legislated in countries like France and then Germany equal citizenship, but often this was still associated with lots of discrimination. French Jews were particularly shocked by the Dreyfus affair, when a French Jewish officer was framed for treason. And then, starting about the late 1880s, in Russia in particular, there were terrible anti-Jewish pogroms with riots, large numbers of Jews being killed. And moving forward into the period just before the Holocaust, think what it feels like to be Jewish, to be in a situation where you're being persecuted, potentially being killed, and nobody in the world really wants to take you in. The Avian Conference was the major Western powers getting together to talk about the Jewish refugee problem, the way that people today might talk about the Middle Eastern refugee problem. And they all decided that they were basically full. You know, America was full. It wasn't going to take more Jews. And from the time I first heard it, I've never forgotten the story of the St. Louis between May and June of 1939. And this is a ship full of refugees that set sail from Hamburg to go to Cuba, where they were supposed to have visas to allow them to take refuge in Cuba. And they got to Cuba, and the Cubans changed their mind. They took on a small number of refugees, particularly the highly qualified ones, medical doctors, etc., but the rest they wouldn't take. And this ship then tried to go to the United States, and the American government put out its Coast Guard to make sure that this ship could not get into an American port. They then tried to go to Canada, and the Canadians did exactly the same thing. The ship came back across the Atlantic to the UK, but it wasn't allowed to dock, just in case they all got off and stayed. Instead, some people, especially children, were taken off by boat from the ship to the UK. And the rest ended up back in Antwerp on the European mainland. And I think there were 500 and something of them, and about 250 of those have since been traced to deaths in the Holocaust. And you may or may not know about this story beforehand, but I can guarantee that virtually every Jewish person growing up in the UK today knows this history. So, briefly, just going over the history, I talked about the pogroms. The pogroms in Russia are about the time that we started seeing immigration of European Jews into Palestine. As Marwan said, there was already a significant Jewish community there. They'd always been there since the days of Jesus Christ. But these were new Jewish immigrants. They were buying land, often from absentee landlords in Egypt or Turkey, or sometimes from local Palestinians. The British then conquered Palestine, and we had the Balfour Declaration, which you've seen before, but I want to put it back on screen. A few phrases are highlighted in red that are particularly striking. The Declaration talks about the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, as if they were sort of an afterthought. These existing non-Jewish communities were 90% of the population at that time. You heard about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where Britain and France carved up the Middle East, and the British basically promised Palestine to the French as part of dividing it up. They promised it to the Jews, that's the Balfour Declaration. They promised it to the Arabs, to encourage the Sharif to revolt against the Ottomans. They also promised it to the Turks. They were trying to persuade Turkey to abandon Germany in the war, and part of the deal was that if the Turks abandoned that, they would be allowed to keep sort of Palestine. The British would have promised Palestine to anybody that they could, if they thought it would help the British war effort in World War I. This is why Britain has a reputation in the rest of the world as perfidious Albions who can't trust British diplomats. But the Arabs shouldn't take it personally that the British promised them something and then didn't keep their promise, because that's what they did to everybody else as well. A bit more of the history. I've been to Israel and Palestine twice. On both occasions I visited Hebron. And if you've not been to Israel and Palestine, I recommend going. Because apart from anything else, you learn about the place, but also the Palestinians need your spending money. They need you to go and stay in Palestinian-owned hotels, to buy things in Palestinian shops, because life is tough for them. And the more Muslim tourists Israel gets, the more its own commercial interests might actually change. But in Hebron, which today is terrible, there's a small Jewish community of a few hundred people, protected by about 2,000 Israeli soldiers, and in the old city of Hebron, where basically Arabs are excluded from large parts of it. And the Ibrahimi Mosque, where the prophets Abraham, Isaac and Jacob are buried, has been partitioned between the Jewish side, which has got the grave of Jacob, and the Muslim side, which has got the graves of Abraham and Isaac. And it's the most soul-destroying place I saw on both my trips to Israel and Palestine. But the thing I've never forgotten is that in 1929 there was a terrible massacre in Hebron when about 70 Jews in Hebron were massacred and about 50 or 60 in Jerusalem and other places. The total death toll was about 150, I think, on the Jewish side, and a much smaller death toll on the Palestinian side. From 1936 to 1939, the Arabs of Palestine revolted. They basically tried to throw the British out. And the British suppressed that revolt with extreme brutality. There's no other way to put it. But that's what occupying powers tend to do when the natives revolt. Remember the Indian Mutiny and the way that was put down. Then there are some maps which I'm going to look at. You've seen some of these maps already, but let's just take a quick look at them. This was, on the left, is the Peel Commission. This was a British commission talking about how to partition the land between Arabs and Jews, with special status for Jerusalem. The Jews were interested, they were willing to contemplate partition, although some Jews wanted all of it, but most of them were realistic and were prepared to accept some kind of partition, but the Arabs were not in the least bit interested. Then in 1947, the United Nations sent a fact-finding mission to Israel and Palestine, as it then was, and all for Palestine then. And the Jews of Palestine wined them, dined them, gave them as much information as they could, as much persuasion as they could, bribes possibly, to try to come up with a report that would be favourable to the Jewish community. What did the Arab community do? The leadership of the Arabs totally boycotted this UN delegation, and furthermore they said that any Arab who meets with the delegation will be killed. The delegation went back to New York and they wrote a report which almost certainly was more biased towards the Jewish position than it would have been if the Arabs had talked to them, and came up with this partition plan. The Jews didn't like it, but they swallowed hard and said, this is better than nothing, we will accept it. The Arabs turned it down. That could have been Palestine today if the Arabs had not turned it down. And the war that followed was a war that was started by local Palestinian Arabs, and then later the armies of 5 Arab states invaded, and the Jews managed to defeat them. And the next line along is the armistice line in 1949. That armistice line, the Arab states rejected. They refused to make peace along that line. They could have done it. And that line actually has the old city of Jerusalem squarely inside the Arab bit, which was then occupied by Jordan. Some more history. The 1967, somebody said 7-day war, it was actually the 6-day war. And there's no doubt about it, the Israelis fired first. I was 15, 16 at the time. I remember watching it on television, in the newspapers, the surprise, but everybody knew that a war was coming because the Egyptians had thrown the United Nations peacekeepers out of Sinai. They moved in their armies, and everybody was waiting for Egypt and Syria to attack Israel, and the Israelis attacked first, which was sensible on their part. They said desperately to King Hussein of Jordan, please don't get involved. King Hussein's view, possibly accurately, was if I don't get involved, my own people will kill me. So Jordan did get involved in the war, and the West Bank was then occupied. If Jordan had not got involved with the war, nothing would have changed on the West Bank. The Yom Kippur War, 1973, was a brilliant attack by Egypt and Syria trying to recapture what they'd lost, but it failed. And afterwards, Egypt decided it wasn't going to be able to destroy Israel, and to get Sinai back, Egypt signed a peace treaty, which it's stuck with ever since. 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. No doubt about it, it was Israel invading Lebanon. I remember waking up to the horror of the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp massacres when the Israelis let the Maronite Christians in to massacre the Palestinians. Hamas was founded in 1987. Quite important. Hamas, the Islamic Salvation Front. Until then, the PLO itself has always been a secular organisation consisting of Arabs who are Muslims, Arabs who are Christians, Arabs who are atheists. But Hamas is an explicitly religious organisation. In 1993, we had the Oslo Accords, which you heard about earlier, and Jordan made a peace treaty with Israel in 1994 and washed its hands of the West Bank. Second Intifada in 2000, terrorist bombings inside Israel. That's why we have the horrible separation barriers. That separation barrier exists to stop suicide bombers getting in to kill Israelis in Israel. Sharon moved out of Gaza, took up the Jewish settlers out of Gaza. And then there was another war with Lebanon. You can decide whether it was Hezbollah that started that or Israel, but Israel has no vested interest in having wars. It doesn't want to occupy Lebanon, not on a permanent basis. Then I got more energized about this case in 2008 with the conflict between Gaza and Israel, which was then repeated in 2012 and again in 2014. Let's look at where things stand today. Israel has about 8.5 million people, of whom 75% are Jewish and 20% are Arabs, and the Arabs are almost all Muslims. A small percentage of the Arabs are Christians and other, and 5% other nationalities, some Ethiopians, for example. The Palestinians, just under 3 million on the West Bank, about 1.8 million in Gaza, and the 6 million diaspora, mostly in the Arab states. And only one of those Arab states, Jordan, has given Palestinian refugees in Jordan equal citizenship rights. The others basically keep them bottled up on refugee camps. The Palestine Liberation Organization, its objectives are to end the occupation and to have a two-state solution. That's what it signed up to in the Oslo Accords. The question marks about the extent to which they agree on demilitarization, because a fundamental Israeli goal is that a Palestinian state should not be able to attack them. So they want a Palestinian state, if it exists, to be basically demilitarized, not to have tanks, missiles.
Be allowed to attack.
Can we leave the questions till later? There'll be plenty of time for that.
And the PLO still wants the right of return, which Maron was talking about. This is the right of the 700,000 refugees and their descendants to go back into Israel itself, west of the Green Line, the 1949 armistice line. This slide, I've deliberately labelled it fairly provocative. I call it Palestinian acts of self-harm. This is Palestinians doing things that are not in Palestinians' own best interests. Promoting his hatred of Israel to their own children. Honouring terrorists. The idea that somebody killed 20 Jewish children by setting up a suicide bomb, the Palestinians named the street after them.
Total rubbish.
And the Palestinians named the street after them or square after them.
Can I just ask the audience to kindly wait till the end of have questions?
Can I ask you seriously, how find out how socialism
Okay, if you have questions, there will be plenty of time. Hang on.
Get involved all the
No.
time with the red button
Yes,
and everybody
yes.
has a microphone and a speaker.
Can you please continue? We will have questions. We're all civilized people. We'll have questions.
We are civilized people should be saying.
Everyone has a right to their opinion, and we can then question it. Okay?
Similarly,
Thank you.
the Palestinian Authority harms itself when it pays stipends, pensions, money annually to the families of terrorists, people who carried out terrorist attacks.
No, hang on. I think we should allow Mr. Amin to have his views, because otherwise we will get into this controversy that will be never
What
ending.
about the King
So
David
there will be a
Hotel?
time.
With the Jewish Haganah at the King David Hotel, where they bombed and killed all the British
Yes,
people.
listen, we can have next.
In fact, I'm going to boycott this speaker. I'm going to boycott this speaker. And I suggest everybody walks out and turns their backs
Okay,
on.
if anyone wishes to leave, they're
I've
entitled
never
to.
heard such loads of biased bullshit propaganda.
And we will
Allow
continue.
Mr. Amin to speak under
Okay, we will get.
Hasan is a disgrace to Rasheed.
Kindly, please, you can remove yourself. This is the problem that I was highlighting earlier on.
Be open-minded. You be open-minded.
Right, please, you have the right to leave or to remain. You will also have ample time to question anything that any of the speakers maintains. Right, I think we should continue.
Open-minded as you would like. When he is calling that Palestinians are teaching their children hatred of the Jews, that is not correct when they are being killed every day.
Can I, you've had your opinion and we've noted it. There was also time afterwards for the same, but you've chosen to leave, so thank you very much for coming. Please proceed.
The next bullet point, clinging to the myth of return. Asking for something which the other side will not give you under any circumstances is pointless and stops you from making any progress in negotiations with them. And the last one, despite the Oslo Accords, occasionally showing evidence of unwillingness to accept the permanence of Israel. Occasionally the Palestinian authorities, the president, when they're making speeches, will talk about a two-state solution as a sort of partial step or something we, for the moment, rather than accepting that Israel is here permanently, as permanent as anything else can be in human life. I want to talk a bit about Hamas, and if you haven't...
2 minutes.
Okay.
I'll give you the extra 2 minutes.
Right, we're having a lot of interruptions. The Islamic resistance... I would encourage you to get and read the Hamas Charter for yourself. You can find it online and read it. And if you do, when you read it, I think you will conclude, as I certainly did, that this is a totally loathsome organisation. And Hamas' position is very simple. Every square centimetre of Palestine must be Muslim controlled. Hamas is not interested in peace. The most it's ever offered Israel is a temporary truce.
Come on.
Truces are followed by war.
Discuss it later, please. Carry on.
This is the West Bank, where Israel is following a policy that is self-defeating for Israel. I talked before about acts of self-harm by the Palestinians. The occupation of the West Bank and the building of settlements is superficially very attractive for Israel. This is the biggest act of self-harm that Israel is engaged in, because if it carries on, Israel will eventually make a two-stage solution impossible. And when you make a two-state solution impossible, what are you left with? And this slide I've labelled as Israel's trilemma, because there are three fundamental Israeli objectives, or objectives of parts of Israeli society. One is to have a majority of Jewish voters, because they want a state that is a majority Jewish state, so that it will always take in Jewish refugees from elsewhere in the world. That's why the law of return exists. If you have one Jewish grandparent, you qualify as a Jew under the law of return. And why did they have that rule about one Jewish grandparent? Because that was what qualified you for persecution under the Germans. If you had one Jewish grandparent, the Nazis regarded you as Jewish and were willing to persecute you. The other objective is to be a democratic state, a fully democratic state. And the third objective, which a lot of Israelis have, is to have the whole of the land. The problem is that those three objectives are not mutually possible. And you end up with, if you want the Jewish majority of the voters and you want all the land, you have to have the Arabs as non-voters and you have apartheid. If you want to have a Jewish majority country and you want it to be democratic, you go for the two-state solution. Or if you want to have the whole of the land and you want to be democratic, you end up with a one-state solution, but then you don't have a Jewish majority voters. That's the trilemma. And Israeli politics is not willing to face up to this set of decisions. So what do? I can't bring about peace in the Middle East, but there are many things that I do. First of all, I've trained myself to be absolutely precise with my language. I never use the word Israeli when I want to talk about Israeli Jews. I talk about Israeli Jews and I talk about Israeli Arabs. And Marwan, as far as I'm concerned, is an Israeli he's an Israeli citizen. He's an Israeli citizen whose ethnicity is Arab and his religion is either...
He's a Palestinian. He's a Palestinian citizen.
Yeah. He's not a Palestinian citizen, he's an Israeli citizen. He has a passport to say Palestinian.
That's why
I think on this occasion, Marwan has the right to tell us what he thinks he is.
So an Israeli,
that's the right taken away by Israelis.
as far as I'm concerned,
Carry on and finish, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Secondly, there are many organizations that I support that work for genuine shared citizenship. Because, as Marwan said, in Israel, non-Jews face significant discrimination. They face official discrimination, they face even more private sector discrimination. But there are many organizations, Jewish-led organizations in most cases, working to counter that. And I give them money. And there are also lots of NGOs working for peace, and I give them money. And I support better debate in the UK. I help to fund the Council for the Advancement of Arab-British Understanding, which is far less influential than the many pro-Israeli lobby groups. But I help to fund Kabul and this small charity, the Forum for Discussion of Israel and Palestine. The bibliography, the slides will be available to everybody, either by the organisation or eventually on my website. And there's several sets of books that I recommend. I can talk about them later on in the question and answer session if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I mean, there are many things that many of us as individuals do not like to hear, but I think we are a group of grown-up, civilized, educated audience here, and I'm not being condescending or patronizing, but I appreciate the strength of feelings which this conflict has generated. And Mr. Amin actually highlighted why did we do the same for the Congo, which of course was a time-limited event. but for the Congo, I would recommend a bibliography as well. King Leopold's Ghost. Read King Leopold. I was in Antwerp, and I went to a chocolatier, and the woman was selling chocolate that was sculpted in the shape of hands. Do you know why that was? Because those blacks who were the slaves and colonized people of King Leopold, uncle of Queen Victoria, by the way, they had their hands chopped off if they didn't bring enough rubber, because that was the time when motor cars were the business and tires, and King Leopold had been given the Belgian Congo as a present. King Leopold's book by Adam Hochschild is a book worth reading. Thank you very much to both our contributors. We will now have a session of question and answer, and I'll tell you the format of that in order to keep within time and to try everyone, to make sure everyone gets an opportunity. We have a list of questions. I would invite both our speakers to kindly take a seat here. And we will give you a couple of minutes to both sit. Maybe Mr. Amin could sit on my right.
Okay. Right, okay.
And you on my
I
left.
would like to be in the left. I am left.
Over there. Well, I'm actually so far left.
You've done very well there.
Not political.
Pardon the pun.
On the center of the line.
You choose the right one.
So again, in the interest of time, and can I please request again, because we want this as an orderly meeting, is when I ask you to cease, please cease. And we can continue the discussion afterward, either outside or in a pub or in a mosque, wherever you feel comfortable. So the questions that we have already received, I will go one by one, and some of the audience may have those questions because we think these are the most pertinent ones. I will start with Marwan first answering, and then Mr. Amin. The first question, what is the distinction between anti-Israeli views, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism? Does anyone else have that in mind?
Yes.
Over to you, Marwan.
I mean, Zionism is a political ideology. It is European, its roots. It is inspired by intellectuals in Europe, ideology. That it is, I said at the beginning, it has that colonial structure, colonial principles, colonial vision that will justify Theodor Herzl, Discipline Basel, and dream of a Jewish state in Palestine. That's what we know from colonial legacy, colonial history. Now, obviously, in this case, it's more complicated because of the historical connection to the land, to Jews, Muslims and Christians in the Holy Land or Palestine. But in its essence, the vision is taking one group on the land of other indigenous communities who live there and establishing a new regime. Now, Israel is a political structure, a state that's been formed, which is one of the manifestations of Zionism. It has its political structure, political parties. It's to some extent it's a democracy. It has lots of criticism also, because just both of us mentioned the other side of the democracy that it has, the discrimination that this regime has, and anti-Semitism. It's a European phenomena that came against Jews, and a few of the speakers here mentioned anti-Jewish pogroms and feelings and actions taken in Europe. Now, criticize it. I am against all form of racism,
So we
including...
we just wanted to know the distinction between these three.
Yeah, so the anti-Semitism is based on views of one group against another. Okay? But it's a form of also racism, because it's against...
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we all agree
Yeah.
on that. So the difference between, a distinction between anti-Israeli views, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Basically, the categories that Marwan has outlined are categories I agree with. Anti-Zionism is being opposed to the Zionist desire to move to Israel and to move to Palestine and create a Jewish majority state there. And being since it now exists, if you're anti-Israeli, you're basically opposed to the same thing. Anti-Semitism is basically hatred of Jews. And one of the things I've written about on several occasions is, are they the same thing? And they're clearly not. Somebody who is anti-Zionist may hate Jews or he may not hate Jews. The only way to find out is to see what this person says, how he says it, what other things he says. It's quite clear that some people who are anti-Zionist definitely do hate Jews, and other people definitely don't hate Jews, but they're anti-Zionist.
So some people would argue that Zionism in its origins was a positive movement. After the Dreyfus Affair, as you know, Zionism took really on throughout Europe. And anti-Zionism in its present state may not be the same as when the Jews were suffering. It's a bit like, personally, and you said we should talk for ourselves, someone might say, if we were living in the 30s, I would at this moment be campaigning for against the persecution of the Jews. So at that time I would be a Zionist. But now, Zionism is... So actually, in order to continue the discussion, thank you very much. You can hang on to that. Firstly,
the difficulty we have...
Can you speak loud, please, or I can do...
The difficulty we have here is that these three terms, anti-Semite, anti-Israel, which is a new one, and anti-Zionism, these are all European concepts. My friends have given the history. Can you tell, was there any anti-Semitic movement in the East ever? What we are doing is we are discussing our agenda which is set by the colonial powers, and we are trying to come to terms and bring ourselves to fit into that model.
Thank you.
And
If
what
you
we
could take
saw
your
already.
comment, thank you.
Very good.
I think it is important that the audience here actually interact with what has been said. And I think, just set questions before was not really very productive in that sense. But I think I've got to take, I've really got to comment on what Mr. Amin has said. I think it has come, I'm going to be polite here, it has come from some ignorance as well. Because I think if you think in terms of the history of going back to the Balfour Declaration, the Jews in Britain actually opposed it. There was a Jewish member of the British cabinet, right? I think he actually opposed it and he called it racism because Balfour himself was a racist. He was an anti-Semite.
So,
but let me finish. So I think that's where this comes from. The idea was that the Europeans would use, like they did, they sent people to Australia. They were people who actually imprisoned. They sent their prisoners to Australia to colonize it. They were sending their unwanted people to go and colonize Palestine. That was the idea that the Balfour and people like the Europeans had at the time. So I think that's where that comes from. I think Amin went on to say that Israel is all for peace, all right, and it's the Palestinians who always rejected it. Now I think Mr. Amin hasn't actually read Netanyahu's statement when in not this election, but in the previous election, he said there will be no Palestinian state on my watch. All right. Now that is a very clear sentence. He was saying that to his electorate. He has never actually accepted, no Israeli actually ever accepted the existence of the Palestinian people. Golda Meir said there is no such thing as the Palestinian people. Right? And their founding figure actually said that the young will forget, the old will die about the Palestinians.
Yep.
All right? So I think all that has to be taken into account. It is completely a colonial setup, settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is embedded into racism.
So, Mr.
So I think,
Yeah.
would you
and also
agree?
Mr.
Can I just interrupt you?
Let me
I'll
just
let you
finish
come
by
back.
one sentence. And I think, you see, Mr. Amin talked about mutiny. It wasn't mutiny, it was the War of Independence. All right? So I think the terrorists were the Israelis. What became IDF came from terrorist organizations. They blew up the King David Hotel.
Yes.
Right?
So terrorism, you know,
Terrorism
the old
is one man's
cliche.
terrorism is somebody
Yes,
else's
that's the
freedom
old
fighter.
Yeah.
Could I ask to amplify your point? It's always struck me particularly that we find many more Jews who support the Palestinians and hardly any Arabs who support Israel.
Apart from the ruling elite within the Arab countries.
Yes, but I meant the general populace. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah.
Well, let me first of all go back to what you said about the Balfour Declaration. And one of the books on my reading list is a book entirely about the Declaration, which I recommend reading. And you said that all the Jews in the UK opposed the Declaration. That's not true. They were
No, he said he qualified that one member of parliament.
No, but the majority did say opposed it.
They were divided.
In fact, the Jewish, the rabbis.
We can't decide it, but
The Board of Deputies
Board of
actually
Deputies,
did.
yeah, they opposed it.
That's a
Jews in the UK were divided because some of them felt that the establishment of a Jewish state would undermine their status as British citizens. They were divided, but there were significant numbers on both sides of the argument. And Balfour himself was a very interesting person. He was somebody I would describe as a Christian Zionist. He was not anti-Jewish. Balfour was Christian, but he was not anti-Jewish.
Actually, what happened was just a historic, funny anecdote. The Lord Rothschild was actually sitting outside when the Balfour Declaration was being discussed. And I think it was Mark Sykes who went out and he said, "Congratulations, it's a boy," when the declaration passed.
Yeah.
But thank you very much
Yes,
for your comment.
Yeah.
You have a point to make.
I was just going to say, Lord Curzon was there too, and he said, what's going to happen to the indigenous people? What's going to happen to the Palestinians? So he was the one who queried, Balfour's letter at the very beginning. And also, we were trying to make friends with Chaim Weitzman because he had a chemical understanding which would help us build weapons for the war. Therefore, we wanted the Jews on our side because they were also having some discussions with Germans and could have swung to that side. So it's a very complicated period.
The evil that men do.
But there's no doubt about it that I think that Balfour was, in a sense, a Christian fundamentalist.
And you're right that there are evangelical Christians who support Israel so that when they're all gathered there, some Armageddon and the apocalyptic four horses will trample over them. Thank you very much. What we have done is we have selected, it's not questions that are planted, these are topics that are hot. And on that we want to expand. We will have free questions as well. I will give you 1 minute to make a point because you've already made one.
Just one point. Instead of having this Jewish and Arabs, I don't think there's much work done on Israel as a colonial project by the colonial powers, because they didn't have much time to control the Middle East before it was part of Ottoman. So it was as a political project that it was embedded in there and so control for the future.
Okay, that's a possibility.
So that's one possibility.
That's a hypothesis. The next point that is quite hot is that of Jerusalem. Time and time again we see on Fridays usually there's a big rami, as they say in Glasgow, between outside the mosque and so on. So what in your views should be the status of Jerusalem were there to be any settlement? Marwan.
Well, I lived in Jerusalem for many years with my daughter, and we have a particular sort of attachment to it. Brought up as a Muslim and have a particular attachment to it. But I want to take a secular perspective. I don't have the same feeling that many Muslim Christians and Jews would have towards the place. Because I want to respect these rights for everybody, I would say they should have equal access to religious sites. But there is the other side of the coin, which is Jerusalem as a national symbol for the Palestinians. So there is a religious aspect, which is, I agree and respect, and should be an access to everybody. But also, it's important for Palestinians as a capital. That is the capital of the Palestinian future state, if it will happen. So, in that way, Palestinian, East Jerusalem, I just want to remind you that East Jerusalem is occupied part of the West Bank and Gaza.
So the question is, what should be the future if there is a settlement?
If there is access to everybody, and
On
there
equal
should be an equal terms to religious places, but in terms of the political symbolism, should be also the Palestinians should see it, if they want, as their capital.
Okay.
Political symbolism.
Thank you very
Yes.
much, Marwan. Mr. Amin.
What I think should happen is, first of all, the old city of Jerusalem itself should be internationalized, because it's too important to let either the Palestinians or the Israeli state have total control over it. And that was the idea in the original United Nations partition plan, that was the idea in the Pew report.
Who would control it?
It would be internationally controlled by the United Nations.
Who controls the United Nations?
The United Nations is controlled by the countries of the world.
So you're basically giving
Dr. Hasan and Mr. have to have this time to make a comment on it, and I'll bring you back after this. Interestingly, the United Nations is let Mr. Amin finish his point.
So the old city of Jerusalem should be internationalized. West Jerusalem is Israeli, and East Jerusalem is where the Palestinians should have their capital. And I would like to see the place without a physical wall between them, which is what you can get once you have peace.
So, Amir, do you want to come back?
No, I'm okay. That's fine.
Dr. Rahman.
It's very interesting. I was in Israel on one of the last week before the Intifada, and this was being discussed, and I've been reading the Jerusalem Post, and it seemed, I may have been wrong, because I'm not an expert in this, that this was far advanced at that stage, and the view was that UN would administer it. The Arabs said that they don't want Britain or America, and China and Russia were not accepted, so they were going to ask the French to administer it on behalf of the, sorry, this always goes at the wrong time, let me just do that, and they were going to administer it on behalf of the United Nations.
The United Nations recently overwhelmingly passed a resolution that the Chagos Islands should be returned to the Chagosians. They even expelled the dogs from that island to create it. So I don't know how whether the United Nations has any
able to run some
all the countries. And interestingly, the ones who vetoed that were Hungary, Austria, Israel, the United States, and the United Kingdom, of course. Thank you. Now, any other points on this? You would like to make one point?
Just one point. Against that background, recently there has been, and I think that's going to happen, is that Jerusalem, there is a background struggle going on between Riyadh, Oman, and to be the custodian. And we know who wins, whoever has the more wealth and alliance, they will win.
Again, this is an interesting hypothesis. I'm not so sure about its validity.
Can I say just one sentence?
Yes.
I mean, we all the time when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk just about the old city and the holy places. But it's not, Jerusalem is much bigger than that. And I think if you look and if you go and visit and see Jerusalem, you see how the wall is divided, Jerusalem and many of the suburbs of Jerusalem being excluded. We lived in Jerusalem. There was a checkpoint. We have to cross the checkpoint to go to the old city, and this is true for many thousands of Palestinians in Jerusalem. Not just about the old city, the holy place. So what is happening now is really there is an ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. The number of people who lost their citizenship in Jerusalem over the years, got to over 10,000 people who live in Jerusalem, they lost their ID, and therefore they cannot really come and live in Jerusalem. And what behind that is to make sure the less Palestinians will be in Jerusalem, not just the Old City, but the suburb of Jerusalem. That's what really behind this policy in Israel.
In the interest of time, there is, because we have to move on, I will bring you back, the point is, the question is, there is a rising tide of anti-Semitism in countries like Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries that is well documented. Is it a paradox that the Israeli government, despite this rising tide of anti-Semitism, is establishing close relationships with those governments? I'll let you answer first.
It is a paradox, and it is an illustration of how state interests, political interests on the part of people like Netanyahu, economic interests, often outweigh the interests of their own citizens and people. And Jewish commentators in this country and in Israel regularly criticize the Netanyahu government for the way that it's cozying up to people like Orban and Kaczynski in Poland. It's deplorable.
Thank you.
My concern is the silencing of. I said it. I said it again. I'm against all these forms of anti-Semitism, racism that in any community here or society in Europe. My worry is that any criticism of Israel policies is become red line, become any voice of Israel criticism, you would be labeled in this. And this is my worry and my concern. Even just to add to that, you know, the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanction. There is obviously, as I said, the power relation between Israel and the Palestinians is legitimate, is mobilizing people around the world. Call came from the Palestinian civil society to exercise leverage to make Israel rethink its policies. And one of them is to you, an ordinary citizen, have the right to boycott. I don't want to buy settlement products. I don't want to encourage, I want to advocate, make a civil movement that will boycott Israeli theater or other groups. The aim of it to exercise leverage. So this is what I want to say, that this is not legitimate in Israel. Me saying this is a risk. If I were to go tomorrow, next July, to visit my family, I can be arrested and interrogated because I'm calling for BDS. And many Israelis and Palestinians facing the same. So that's where the risk is, the silencing of any criticism against the Israeli policies.
One brief point before we move on to the next point.
Okay. Well, I just want to come back to this Jerusalem issue, because Jerusalem represents what the Israelis are doing in Jerusalem, represents the real nature of the Israeli state, which is racism. I mean, I've got Palestinian friends in this city who are from Jerusalem, whose mother and father were both born in Jerusalem, who's married to a woman from Jerusalem. He is not allowed to go to Jerusalem. Now, any Palestinian who's living in Jerusalem is not the citizen of Jerusalem. He is the resident, and that residency can be taken away any time the Israeli government wanted to take it away. So he has limited rights compared. I mean, if that happens in Birmingham, Muslims have different rights to the English people living in this city. There will be a huge call. I mean, even the National Front would ask for that, right? But that is what Israel is doing. It's totally a racist, colonial structure that it represents in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Yes. Can I contribute? Because last Sunday there was one talk, and I was shocked to know that no Palestinian has a right in Israel to go to the Supreme Court to challenge anything.
Yeah.
And they, because they don't have equal rights or equal citizenship, As we said, they need everywhere permit and anything. Is that not a clear apartheid?
Mr. Amin might know.
Can we clarify the question? Because are we talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel, or are we talking about Palestinians from the West Bank? The West Bank is occupied. It's under Israeli military law. Palestinian citizens of Israel face some discrimination, but by and large, they have equal citizenship with Jewish citizens of Israel. One interesting point is that when Moshe Katz...
Are they allowed to take a case to
Yes,
Supreme
of course.
Court?
And not only that, there's an Arab judge on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that sent a former Prime Minister of Israel, a former president, to jail for rape. One of the judges that sent him to jail was an Arab.
Thank you. That brings us on to the next point. Is the recent nation-state law an example of apartheid?
The nation-state law is disgraceful, it's clearly racist, and it exists for internal Israeli Jewish political reasons as a way of basically getting votes from extreme Jews.
That's a weird justification.
Is it apartheid? Probably not. Let's look at the nation-state law. What it does is that, first of all, it downgrades the status of Arabic. Before, Israel had two equal official languages, Hebrew and Arabic. The nation-state law has downgraded the status of Arabic to another language, whereas Hebrew is the official language of the state. That's not a good thing, but in this country, English is the official language of our country. The nation-state law says that only the Jews of Israel have the right to something called self-determination.
Hang on now, I come from Scotland. Hang on. I come from Scotland. And I go to the Highlands a lot for walking holidays and to the Western Isles. And Gaelic is easily taught there, and it's equal to English in fact, my own railway station in Aberdeen, which is not even a Gaelic-speaking city, has to be named in Gaelic. So would you like to extend that?
I'm not here to defend the nation-state law. I'm here to tell you.
No, but the language you say is not apartheid.
You have to decide what apartheid means.
Okay, thank you. So we need to go back and look at apartheid. It's your turn now.
I mean, it's interesting because you agree. I mean, you agree that it's a racist.
Yes.
You agree that some of the laws are racist. You agree that there was wars before. What is missing is the lines. You have the dots, and you just need to make the line. And the line is that there is this. There is a systematic. The wars, the settlements. We're talking about viable Palestinian state. Viable Palestinian state. The West Bank, 62% of the West Bank is under Israeli control. They control the resources, they control the land, they control the security. And if it would be a Palestinian state, still, the sky, the borders, and the Jordan Valley would be under Israeli control. So what is it? That's why I didn't even want to go into the discussion of two states, because I think it is finished as an option. It's gone. So let's think of something that it will be based on citizenship, on equality, on principles of inclusion of everybody who is living there.
Okay, thank you. What you have said and what you have said simply can be expressed as if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck and it swims like a duck, then it can be a duck.
Most likely.
Most likely. But that's a personal view, and I fully respect your view that you think it is not apartheid. That brings on to the next question and I would like Marwan to start. This is very important, I think. For Palestinians, is armed struggle or peaceful resistance the answer, or should both methods be used?
Well, I said first of all that I myself would promote nonviolent resistance
You're the Gandhi of.
No, well, I'm not the Gandhi. I'm not a pacifist, but I am. But I think it is important to recognize in the power relation between the Israel and the Palestinians, and that the Palestinians who are under occupation and being expelled, it is enshrined in the international law that they can defend themselves, including using armed resistance. Let me just, in a comment, it's connected to the right of return, like why the Palestinians want to argue for something completely unrealistic. So if you take this parallel to national movements around the world, what if you said, oh, and I am a national movement, want to get rid of colonialism? It is not, it is too hard, it is impossible, so let's give up from the beginning. So the logic that there is a power there is an oppression, and we will raise our hands and we will accept what they say, it is a surrender. So in terms of movement, of non-violence movement, I wrote about it. I think there is a shift in the world in terms of the ordinary people, not the politicians, not the governments, supporting Palestinian rights. There is a clear change in the world in terms of internationalization. Ordinary person, any person, want to do something. They can feel that there is injustice. They know that it's wrong, so they want to take an action. And I think that was one of the most important shifts in the Palestinians. The Palestinians realized that it is not possible to defeat Israel militarily. Therefore, more and more thinking being done, and it is been happening now in the occupied Palestinian territory to respond in a non-violent way. However, the response is violent. It's brutal in some of the places that I saw just a few weeks ago. I was there and I saw how the army is responding. I want to take another reflection. I see this brutality of the soldiers, but also, you know what, I feel sometimes sorry, because these are 18, 19 years old. They are responsible, they're taking guns, and they are brutalizing Palestinians. That's the harm, that they're doing. Israel is doing to its population, to its young people. If you read and look, hundreds of Israeli soldiers, after they finish their conscription and 3 years, you know where they go? To India, to Nepal. Why? They want to clean their heads. We want to be disconnected. Disconnected from what? From the brutality. Brutality is not just practice against the Palestinians, but you will internalize it. The trauma is also there, and that's where I think we should look at the harm. Not to accuse the victims of their harming themselves because they are not standing up. It's to look, what is the source of the violence, where it comes from, what is the structural violence that's making it. So in a way, I work with, as I said, with a lot of Israeli teenagers, and you could see how this is brutalizing the whole Israeli society.
Who will look after the custodian?
One small question, connected to this, one you can answer. Do you think now Palestinians have less support in the world than before, like in 70s? And if you can see on that,
it's a different. There is a shift. There is a new generation, young people.
Why
today.
and why?
Why? Well, I think. Also I'm reflecting, given that we are also reflecting. There is a problem internally in Palestine. There is a division. There is lack of cohesion. We have a lot of work to do ourselves. I'm also say that, and I write about that, and I communicate this and reflect this with people. The more we are, the more the coordination, the more the cohesion, as it happened in 88, 87, and other times, the more there is cohesion, Palestinians, the more we can influence even the Israeli society. You know, in 87, 88, we had the most the highest number of Israeli organizations who was in support of Palestinian rights. Women organizations, social workers, doctors. But why? Because it's the Palestinians who led the struggle and then knocked at the door of the oppressors to say, you have a moral responsibility also to do something about it.
Thank you very much. The question was, Mr. Amin, and you might want to say that Palestinians don't even need to struggle since everything is so good for them. Should it be peaceful resistance or violent resistance, or a combination, if they should resist?
Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza almost certainly have the moral right to resist violently, but violent resistance in that situation is one of these things I describe as self-harm. It has done massive amounts to worsen the position of Palestinians in the West Bank. That's why the West Bank has all these concrete barriers dividing it up, because of the suicide bombings. And the reason why the blockade of Gaza is the way it is because Hamas keeps trying to attack Israel from Gaza.
Thank you. Any comments or points?
I have a question. No, just comment whatever. I believe, and I think that it is probably, I feel as well, that by becoming more extremist, the Israeli government in the last 15 or 20 years, they've become more extremist, they've become more racist, they've become more exclusive. I think it is harming them. And I think that in a time to come, the ordinary people of the world are going to line with Palestine. It might be a bit late for them, but things can happen, things can swing, and it may not be in favor of Israel. And because they are brutally, what you call, dehumanizing the civil aspect of living people who are in occupied territories.
You do have a point first.
Yeah, I have just the border between Gaza and Egypt. Why is it not discussed? Why not get rid of that border and get the economy going between Gaza and Egypt?
It is Egypt.
Why can't Egypt
close the Rafah border?
It is first of all, sovereign state.
Yeah, but why don't they make a deal with Egypt? Why don't the Palestinians make a deal with Egypt?
Why don't the Palestinians make a deal with Egypt?
Like saying why they didn't establish the Jewish state in Uganda or Kenya?
No, but there's a wall blocking Gaza from Egypt, so why is that wall there? Why
The
don't the
answer to
Egyptians
that
say
is
get rid of
that
the wall?
Egypt is the largest outside. After Israel, they get the most assistance and subsistence from America, and they will always do whatever.
Could I please ask?
There is a lot of smuggling, goods and food and
knock down
arms
the wall and
and
just get an economy going.
But I'm saying that Egypt.
But these Egyptians, they say, oh, we support Palestinians, but they're cowards.
No.
Yes, they can't knock down the wall.
But it's the government, the state, and the people. There's a distance between them.
His question is.
It's so easy. Just get rid of the wall and just get an economy going.
No, it's a good point because you accepted that Gaza.
He got a point.
No, hang on. But you've accepted that Gaza is under siege on three.
It's under siege from the Egyptians as well.
Yes,
So
yes,
get
it
rid
is.
of this. That's the Egyptians being cowards.
You're right.
You just see why they opened their arms. Yeah. On the one hand, they said
Can we please
yes.
let the conversation happen between here and the individual participant? Your point is taken that the Egyptian government doesn't have, they are cowards. But it's the Egyptian state is what Marwan is saying, not the Egyptian people.
Israelis have a political, policy that makes sense from their point of view. They want to protect their thing. Okay, you can morally disagree. But the Egyptians are just being cowards.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, we've agreed on that. Yeah, but Mr. Amin wanted to make a point on that as well, and then
The Egyptian government sees Hamas basically. The Egyptian government sees Hamas basically the same way that the Israeli government sees Hamas, as a terrorist organization And Egypt has a serious problem at the moment in Sinai with Egyptians in the Sinai committing acts of terrorism. They believe that Hamas would actually help them, and that's why the border is firmly closed.
So is Mr. Amin? Is it Mr. Amin? The border is Mr. Amin. The border was open before the Hamas? Nope. So what is this? This is not a. This is not an argument. He's right. He's right.
You first, very quickly.
My point earlier, we are mainly focusing on Israel because most of the people sitting here, I think they have some emotional connections and Palestinians, all those things.
We don't know. Please do not project your views on others.
I'll give an example.
Yeah.
If we take it as a political project, there is no difference between the policies of Israel and Egypt or Saudi Arabia or any other country, a state, as far as the
With an
Palestinians
agenda.
are concerned.
Yeah.
I know my Palestinian friend whose father lives in Egypt, but he cannot go there.
Yes.
He cannot visit Egypt, but we always keep talking about Israel, and we have our kind of emotions we take out, and we go, unless we become non-judgmental, we look at the things.
Okay, thank you. You've been very patient. Thank
No
you very
problem, no problem. Because my question is totally out of the frame discussion. Yeah. And I think it is more deeper and more sensible to think. My name is Abbas, and I am journalist from last 30 years in Birmingham and political activist as well, on the streets, on the roads, organizations, so-called Democrat organizations, so-called, anyway, my question is, what about extreme views in Hamas especially, and all over the Muslim country in the world, like in Pakistan and Kashmir and everywhere. So what, Mr. Marwan, what is your views about Hamas?
Yes. Okay. Let's concentrate on that.
Thank you very
That's a
much.
good question.
I said politically, I'm in one world and they are in another world. Politically, as an ideology, I will not vote. I'm against it. But it is a political in the Palestinian discourse. It's a legitimate political group. If I disagree with it, I can't sort of deleted it, and it's also been elected in 2006. Now, I want to take you back before the outbreak of the Intifada. I remember as an activist in the early 80s, we used to go to Gaza. No problem, it was open, there was no restrictions. My experience that Hamas, well, there was not then Hamas, but it was known as the Islamic group.
Yeah.
They were encouraged, supported, and let be able to organize more activism than secular and Marxist and other groups.
Yeah.
Until it's become a risk
purposely.
to Israel.
That's true.
And I remember that very well. How come, we as, activists can't organize this, and they were able to do that in Gaza.
Everything, yes.
Now, there are, Hamas, it's a political group. The only way to deal with that through open dialogue, Palestinian, to do that internally, to challenge it, to give a vision to the Palestinians, to the people in the West Bank and Gaza, vision that will have future. They will look for alternative politics. Why do you think they voted for Hamas in 2006? Because was corruption within the Palestinian National Authority, yes, and because the only one they were able to stand up against Israel and to say this is not. So obviously there is emotions, there is manipulation, it's politics, but the way forward is to present another vision, alternative, based on equality, based on people who will be able to finish university and find a place to work. Yeah. That's the way if you want to tackle Hamas, not by just calling it a terrorist and outlaw it, and it's not going to move ahead. And through education.
Thank you. Mr. Amin, would you like to say?
Yes. One of the books on my reading list is Once Upon a Country by Sari Nusseibeh, who's the head of Al-Quds University. And he talks about the 1980s and how the Israelis did give quiet support to Hamas as a way of making life harder for the peaceful opposition, the Arab Palestinian opposition. And this is sadly is a tactic that we've seen in many, many places where a government is faced with a peaceful opposition, and as a way of undermining the peaceful opposition, the government secretly supports the more extreme people on the same side of the argument. It normally blows up in their faces, and in the case of Hamas, it's definitely blown up in the Israelis' face, because they've created what now is their worst sort of physical enemy in Gaza.
Yeah,
but yes, the Israelis, I believe, did support Hamas in the late 1980s.
They created it.
So it's called blowback by the CIA. Now, there's one other. Oh, sorry, you had. I beg your pardon.
Yeah, I'm actually was reflecting on the past. Going down the memory lane. I was just remembering Jimmy Carter, the era of Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. When, on the media, I know Americans have always been supporters of Jewish state. There's been no, change in their policies. But during those two tenures of the American presidents, there was apparently an effort to, the Camp David, and then when Yasser Arafat was alive, the Israeli Prime Minister Yasser Arafat, an American president, they actually made very serious effort. And there was a time, I remember in early 90s, when they were close to an agreement. So my question to both Marwan and Mr. Amin is whether we lost the opportunity. Was there a lost opportunity then we could have secured more opportunity for a Palestinian state that we have lost now?
I think that's a good point. But in the interest of time, can I go on to the related question about that is, why did the Oslo Accords not succeed? I'll let you answer first.
The Oslo Accords did not succeed because they were sabotaged by Netanyahu and the Israeli government that came into office in the mid-1990s after Rabin was assassinated. That's the short answer to the question.
Marwan, do you agree, disagree, or expand?
I agree, but I think there was something fundamentally wrong with Oslo. I mean, I was one of those who were optimistic after Oslo. I would reflect and say I was mistaken then. Because it is what happened in Oslo, they divided the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. And the A is where is Ramallah today, and Nablus, and the major cities. And they said to the Palestinians, you have civil control and police. Areas B, it is under Israeli military control, security, but the Palestinians still responsible for education and health. And Area C is totally under Israeli control. It is 60% of the 62% of the land, and the Palestinians can do some work in health and education. And this is will be in stages. Yeah. What they didn't take in consideration that the major issues of settlement, borders, Jerusalem, and refugees being left to the end of the peace process. Now, these are the most important parts. These are the roots of the conflict. And to leave it to the end, it was like shooting, yourself in the foot. And in a way, maybe there was a little option, but because what's just Mr. Amin said, that actually Oslo was dead in the first stage of it, then it was even much harder to move to the next phase 2 and 3.
Quick point by Rahman first.
Yasser Arafat, on reflection, do you think he has been a help or a hindrance?
very hard question, really, to answer. What I can see, I mean, he's, you know, I could list a lot of positive and a lot of criticism of Arafat. He was, you know, he was a symbol of resistance. He managed to keep the PLO and the Palestinian National Movement together. But also he has his own, you know, agenda and control and
First you.
I have a comment, but in a question as well. Being a member of the society and we're living in 2019. But if we see the past history for 1,000 years ago, up till Second World War, up till Holocaust, we should understand that the Jews has been ignored and they has been prosecuted. The Jews have a big history of religion, the Moses, and they should have their holy place as well. But up till Second World War, they have been ignored and they have no place. But I say that the history repeats itself, first in tragedy and second as farce. But what the prosecution has been done with the Jews, and now they got the state, I think, which they have a right, because they should, every religion on earth have their holiest place. So Jews have a right, therefore holy place as well. But what the Jews are doing right now, they're doing the same thing which are happening with them in 1,000 years back.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même
So,
chose.
and the other thing, I just movement. With the Mr. Amin, I say, so the solution, if we go for the Yerushalayim is the center of peace as well. So why not we? I don't think so. This solution is going to be solved in the coming years as well, unless and until really international organization. Security Council, UNA, right now it's in its stage of infant, but with the passage of time, this institution will grow more and they have to take this place.
We live in hope.
Thank you.
Umar,
Just one
to
summing up the question whether that was the end of the hope of Palestinian state after the death of Oslo Accord. I have my own opinion. The British and Britain, it took 60 years and the 3 generations to change the opinion of the local people. I'm not talking about the government of the states. And it was what you call reflected in the second Gulf War, when the school children in London, they protested against Tony Blair, and thousands of the school children went against the restriction imposed on them by the school administration, and they reflected their solidarity with the Iraqi people. In the same way, and like Mr. Amin is here, you know that he is very, what you call, vehemently supporting staunchly, and this is in the same way in America. What you call, it's going to take time, and until the third generation who is going to go into the society and change by interaction the thinking of the people there, I think it is going to take place. It will take time, but the opinion has to change in America to have a significant impact on what you call in the attitude of the Israel towards Palestinians. In the same way, like if you can't control the Taliban in Pakistan, you can't have a control in Afghanistan. If you can't control the politics in America, you can't control the politics in
the Daniel Barron approach.
Omar, I would disagree here. I mean, we are now living in the era of fake news, Twitter, social media, where so much, false information is being poured into the new generation. We don't know what is happening. You have a hope, I have a hope. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
What I want to take from the seminar in terms of inspiration is the message of justice and equality that Rasheed you provoke today, and I think that what gives me the hope internationally is not the government, it's not the European Parliament, it's not the UN, but like in South Africa, it was the movement in these societies, in Pakistan, in London, in Norway, in the US. It is inspiring to see Jewish activists, Do you know how many Jewish activists been prevented from going to Israel because of their politics? Hundreds. This is, I think, where would be the inspiration, that a new generation in the US here will start to see that there is a injustice, that there is an oppression, and this movement is only way to exercise power and to change the politics.
On this one, last one, the time is running out of.
Yeah, just a comment that the objective of organizing today's debate was to stimulate a discussion, and of course the speakers are contributing to that. So I would only request the audience to not express very strong judgments and opinions about this.
I second that.
Yes.
So we've got only 4 or 5 minutes left. I'll let you go. We then have to sum up very quickly, and then you just briefly comment.
I think whatever has been done in the past, we can only cry over spilt milk. I'm talking about 2019. The reality of today is the politics is all economy based, and you are seeing flourishing of all the right-wing extremist politics, whereas in US, where in Netanyahu, whereas in other parts of the world. And what they are delivering is, they are delivering to the local people who are benefiting from their politics, and they are getting elected and democratically getting validated. So in this environment, where do you see the hope?
Thank you. Very briefly, please.
Have the microphone.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you to the speakers and to our chair, who's been very fair-minded and judicious. Thank you very much. I first went to Palestine in 1963, before many of you were born. I went because I thought the kibbutz were making the desert blossom like the rose, and I was full of enthusiasm. It's too long ago for me to remember quite how it happened, but I returned to England with a strong feeling that, for the Palestinians, and that they were somehow being disinherited by the actions of the Israelis. I went then again in 2012, in February, when it was wet, windy and cold, to plant olive trees. And I experienced checkpoints and tear gas. I met people whose houses had been demolished, people who had died because they weren't allowed over a checkpoint, roads that only Israelis could drive on. And I came back to England really deeply distressed, and it was not a distress that was going to go away. And I knew I had to do something, because if you speak to Palestinians and say, what can you do? They say, tell people. So I launched the North Staffordshire Olive Tree Campaign, because you can buy an olive tree for £15, and that supports a farmer who's losing his fields to the military occupation. I then met a psychotherapist from Gaza who had been here to do an MA, and he was not able to return to his family in Gaza because they closed the border. And he was running out of money, so he came to stay with me while he got a new job. As a psychotherapist, he had worked in Gaza and the West Bank, and he had met many mental health workers who had very great difficulty sustaining their clinical practice, and who often suffered burnout and compassion fatigue because they were under the very same pressures as their patients. And so the North Staffordshire Olive Tree Campaign morphed into Samud Palestine, Samud being steadfast. You are Samud if you're going to stay on your land regardless. And we now have a very consistent program of training for mental health workers, which has led to the establishment of the Palestinian Association of Cognitive and Behavioural Therapy, which is being recognised now by the European and the World Association. And what I want to ask the people to do here is to take away two things. First, you must support the BDS campaign, and it is not anti-Semitic to do so, because this is a civil, non-violent campaign launched by the Palestinians, and they're asking us to boycott goods in the settlements. That means, of course, we've got a campaign at the moment against Uber. But the other thing is, it's Ramadan, we're sending money to the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza so that they can help some of the most poor Muslims celebrate the end of Ramadan. And I want you to remember here that you can support the medical aid for Palestinians, you can support Palestine, so that your political action is matched by, you know, your words. They're not just words, but action that you give your money.
Thank you for that contribution. And could I thank the audience for being so patient? And I do apologize for those who still wanted to make comments. We can discuss that ad nauseum, but time is our enemy. And what does our enemy say? That it's time to thank my two contributors. And I hope that this debate continues, and I hope that there will be peace in Palestine one day. Yeah. And thank you, and also tribute to the memory of Dr. Rasheed Hasan
There's some Palestinian goods outside, please buy them because that will have to farm as well.